All right. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I've been so looking forward to this conference, and it's been really terrific working with Georgia State and the Nunn School together to bring everyone here to talk about these really important issues, and specifically to think about emerging technologies within the context of non-state actors. So this is the panel on cybersecurity, and I'm very excited about this panel. I think that there's so many different ways that we can think about the role of information security, cyber capabilities, and specifically from the perspective of non-state actors. I think so much, at least in international relations, of this discussion has taken place within the context of states. And there's so many different ways that we can think about the intersection between non-state actors and cybersecurity. There's issues that I know some people on the panel are going to be talking about today, thinking about tech companies and how they're addressing these kinds of issues. There's also important issues of how states use cyber capabilities as a tool of statecraft. Do they have a deterrent effect? What kinds of applications can they have for thinking about counterterrorism or thinking about counterinsurgent operations? Cyber escalation, something that Sarah Krebs mentioned in her panel, the distinction between offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. And then, do non-state actors have the ability to use offensive cyber operations? Or how are they using things like social media and using things like in Dr. Bloom's research with encrypted platforms and looking at that? So there's so many different ways in which we can think about cybersecurity within the domain of non-state actors. So I look forward to hearing our panelists' perspectives. So before we turn it to them, I'd like to introduce everyone, and I'm just going to go in order of our presenters. So we first have Paul Harwood, who co-founded 101 Research following his roles as a market research lead and staff quantitative researcher at Twitter and a user sentiment researcher at Facebook. Prior to Facebook and Twitter, he was an associate professor and a research fellow at Pew Internet and American Life Project. And he's also currently a member of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's Risk Communication Advisory Committee. Next, I'd like to introduce, where did it go? I had everything. Here we go. Laith Alkhouri. He is a co-founder and senior director of Advanced Intelligence Solutions at Flashpoint, which is a business risk intelligence company in New York. Laith has conducted primary source research into terrorist groups and their supporters for over a decade, focusing on cyber footprints and technological advancements. And he's presented his research and findings at many government and security institutions, the State Department, Department of Justice, DOD, House Committee on Homeland Security, NYPD. Next up, we have Vivan Guetler, and she's a PhD student in sociology at West Virginia University, where she specializes in crime and culture. And her research is focused on the interaction of technology, computational social science, and network science through a sociological lens. And she's worked on cyberterrorism, terrorist use of technologies for communication, the impact of technology on society, and ethical considerations of machine learning. So perhaps we'll hear some questions from her at a panel later this afternoon. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Audrey Alexander. She specializes in the role of digital communication technologies in terrorism and the radicalization of women. She's a senior research fellow at the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University, and she has authored reports which have included Digital Decay and others. So I look forward to the panel. Thank you. I have one more announcement. I apologize for our mic technical difficulties. There are certain areas in the room where they just don't work well, so I apologize. So please, when you do use the mic, hold it to your mouth, closely so we can hear everyone. And finally, we have books for sale, and I know she didn't want to announce it, so I'm going to do it for her. This is Mia Bloom's new book that is hot off the presses, and so that's available outside as well.
Well, thanks, Jenna. So there's going to be a variety of topics in this section, and I'm going to talk about social media and terrorism, but not the actual usage of social media by non-state actors, but the difficult role that tech companies have in actually addressing the issue. So what I want to do, though, is to begin with the idea of this isn't really a new topic. It's been around for a while that the keyboard is going to be a very powerful tool that a terrorist or a non-state actor may use. However, still today, we have technology companies that have very little guidance, very little regulation as to how they should go about finding and also removing content that is deemed to be of a terrorist. So the keyboard and the associated screen, because the screen is important, irrespective of the device, whether it's the phone or whether it's a computer, is providing a tool for many terrorist organizations. And obviously, there are a variety of reasons why it is so sort of popular for terrorist organizations. And the popularity, obviously, for a terrorist organization is the popularity that individuals in general feel towards the computer, their mobile phone, and all of the applications that can be accessed via both of those devices. So it's nothing really new. And if we think about the role of the government, or the lack of the role of a government, they have had plenty of time to think about these newer technologies. So if we think about the IBM 5150, that's 1981, where the sort of home computer really came into existence. 1993, we're looking at Mosaic. June 1993, there were only 130 websites out there. Today, obviously, there's billions of websites out there. So it's not as though governments and companies should be sort of caught unaware. There has been plenty of time in which regulation could occur. And today, what we have is obviously a lot of applications that are being applied for both good and bad reasons. The most important thing, I think, as we look at the role of social media is the need to sort of avoid the chronocentric approach that because it's happening to us, it's the most important thing since sliced bread. It's also important for governments particularly to sort of not heed the advice of a former sort of US patent commissioner and the idea that everything that has been invented everything that can be invented has been invented. That's clearly not the case. And since we are so woefully behind in terms of regulating social media and regulating technology, maybe looking ahead to think about how we can get ahead of the curve. So if we think in terms of the events that occurred in New Zealand, lots of the focus has been placed on social media companies. But with advancements in AI and other advancements, why should the focus be on the actual social media company and not on the phone provider that could also work in the coming years to integrate, to prevent the actual recording of such events rather than stopping it at the point of dissemination. The other thing I think that's important for us to look at is the idea that technology does nothing to us until we actually apply it. So the idea of social constructivism is more important than technological determinism. So when we hear people say that television has changed US society, television did nothing to US society. It was the fact that America sat in front of it, picked up the remote, and decided to turn it on and watch it. So it was the social component, that actual application, that is important. And if we think about what's actually being done online, there is a lot of information that is being created daily. And these pieces of content are being created around the world. Some of them are obviously being created on platforms that are now large companies, but others are being created on a smaller scale. But if we just think about the number of Facebook status updates per day, 456 million per day, okay? 317,000 updates per minute, okay? So the task that confronts tech companies such as Facebook and others is huge, because not only are they worrying about, terrorism and that content, they're also worrying about pedophilia, they're also worrying about copyright violation from everyone, it seems, this week. So, but if we look at some of the smaller companies, 10 million DAU, 10 million daily active users from Slack. And Slack itself has found that it's now having to address hate issues. 500 million tweets per day, some of them will be from me. So 3+ billion snaps, photos and videos. And these are being done on platforms at companies where individuals aren't focusing on the bad stuff. They're predominantly engineers. They're individuals who are hired to achieve an actual market goal, not to prevent bad sort of content. So I remember when I was at Facebook, because I had taught terrorism at some point, I suddenly was, in 2011, sort of like, well, the go-to guy as to how we should try and begin to address it. But it was really looking at it in terms of a needle in a haystack. We had no idea what we should look at. We had no idea what information we should trust in terms of information that was coming from outside. But efforts have been made to sort of take down terrorist content. So 14+ million pieces of terrorist content have been removed. And the pieces are, so the way that a post or a status update is created is that there are multiple parts. So it could be that the video component is removed or the photo is removed, but the text doesn't violate any rules and can remain online. Twitter, 1.2 million terrorist-related accounts, 28 hate groups from Slack. Alphabet are obviously not only just removing, but in some of their orgs, they're actually redirecting, if we think of some of the work being done by Jigsaw. And Cloudflare, they've removed some groups that would be deemed to be non-state actors by the US government, but others remain. Now, the reason why this is sort of important is a lot of, obviously, press falls upon social media companies that they're not doing enough to remove terrorist content quickly enough. But if we go back and just look at those numbers in terms of how much content is being created in multiple languages, it's not surprising that companies that are built by engineers, not by terrorist experts, are having a huge problem, and they still have very little guidance. They also obviously want to become public, so they have shareholders to deal with. So they have to think about public opinion, okay? So we're at a terrorist conference with terrorist scholars, but we're using Twitter, okay? So it's not like even this organization, this group of individuals have said, well, we're all about finding terrorists and their activities online, but we're still going to use Twitter. And obviously these companies poll their users as to find out what's important. So it's a big sort of juggling game as to just how far you go and how much you do. They're also global entities, so they have local asks. And in my roles at both of them, I would work in countries all around the world. And in some countries, some of the asks as to what they would like you to take down were quite extreme. You also had to deal with the issue of local use cases. So how you may apply your Snapchat or how you may apply Facebook or Twitter is not the same as, say, an Indonesian user will apply any of those three tools. It's not the same as how a Filipino user will apply as well. So it's not that there's one solution that these companies can use to pull content and they're then rosy. Every country has to be treated as a unique unit of analysis. Some of the work and some of the efforts that tech companies make in terms of taking down terrorist content or even recognizing that they have it is by happenstance. So when we were working on the dreaded Facebook accounts that were dog accounts. So 8 million accounts were people who would create an account for their dog. We began to really understand that there were different accounts in terms of a single account, single user. There were single accounts, multiple users. They were the dog accounts. And then there were multiple accounts and single users. And those are some overseas markets that make it very difficult to then track people who are doing bad things in those markets because the way that they're applying Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is very similar to just a regular user. There's also just the huge cost that's involved, and all of this is being done with still very little upfront regulation. Okay, it's very a knee-jerk response, and it's not that the response is wrong. It's just you're dealing with companies. So there's huge costs, both in terms of human monitoring and obviously in terms of the AI that will be applied. There's also we still don't truly understand what the effect on the human monitoring will be. Most of the human monitoring is done overseas, and it's not for costs. It's due to the fact that language capabilities are very important, so that human monitoring must be done overseas. There's also the cost to brand perception. So brand perception in certain key markets can be very negatively impacted by removing certain sites, and it can sort of cause real problems for employee safety. So Jack Dorsey, for example, not only does he have a minder, but behind the scenes there's a whole team that sort of are monitoring to ensure that he remains safe, and also for other staff when they travel overseas. I remember being in Surabaya, Indonesia, which is obviously an area where ISIS does do recruitment, and being woken up after midnight by the police and the hotel manager saying they know that you're here and you have to move to a new hotel now. So we had just taken down some of their accounts. So, and then there's the issue of staffing. Okay, you don't want an engineer dealing with terrorist content, and you don't want any of you doing the coding. So, so in terms of hiring staff, if there are students who are thinking, what would you like to do? Facebook, Twitter, all of these companies are definitely in the need for people who can have a knowledge of terrorism and identifying non-state actor content. And then there's the issue of data collection. So the way these companies collect their data is to understand user satisfaction. It's to understand the user experience and how to make money. It is not to identify bad stuff. And then there's the issue of multiple data sources. So once there is a willingness to sort of like listen and take heed from a government, the question then becomes, well, which government do you listen to? So if the US government asks that this content be taken down, but if the Indonesian government asks or the Philippine government asks, these companies are incorporated in those markets, should they also take them down? And then the other issue is, there's not just governments advising these companies. There are also other actors. And one of the ones that most social media companies dread more than the actual government is anonymous. So I've sat in meetings where you've got the list that the government has given you. You've got the list that anonymous have given you. They do not match. And then the question is, well, did the US government miss one? Or do they want this one still to be left up because they're using it for information? Do we listen to anonymous and take it down? So there's lots of variables. And this is all being done inside of companies which are sort of driven by engineers whose primary task is not sort of understanding how to take down terrorist content. So my talk is really sort of like understand social media companies are trying to do their best. They do have a long way to go. They are beginning to actually hire people who can really help them rather than a group of individuals who may at some time have taught a terrorist class. And but the thing to sort of keep in the back of the mind is this is the actions of the big companies once they've made it big. For a company the size of, say, like Threema, which is obviously one that's very interested for people doing counterterrorism. I mean, they have less than 100 employees, okay? Cloudflare, in terms of the number of employees that are actually full-time, it's still a relatively low number. So the tasks that they have and the staff that they have just don't really commute. Thanks.
We need to talk about yesterday because we need to draw a spectrum. Most people have become familiar with the aspect of jihadist terrorists using the internet with the advent of ISIS expanding into Iraq and Syria and really taking on to social media and really proliferating to make their name a household name. But I want to take you a little bit back to 2003. To the days when most people did not know that Al-Qaeda guys were proliferating online in very elite communities. Communities that they would invite people based on recommendations from other users, individuals who had connections to terror groups on the ground, specifically Al-Qaeda, but also Pakistani Taliban and other. So what we've become familiar with is, kind of looking at social media today with ISIS, right? Looking at Twitter, Facebook, even Telegram, even though it's an encrypted chat service, but it's considered a social media platform. Drawing the expertise directly from the primary source environments where jihadists supportive of Al-Qaeda proliferated, they did not start with having their own social media accounts. It really started in deep web environments that are not indexed by search engines, meaning you needed a username and password to get into these websites, and otherwise you were not able to find the link to that specific website where individuals were being invited joining the groups online in their ecosystem, and then finally networking to join people on the ground. So looking at the deep web environment, the dark web environment, the unindexed environments that bypass a lot of the scrutiny that we have over open web environments. Threat actors became aware of this as much as any experts in the online arena. They realized that since they can bypass the scrutiny, they can proliferate and they can establish ways to network, finance, and so on. So let me take you to the physical to the cyber. I've been using this caricature for over 10 years now, and I think it's still very relevant today. When you're online, no one knows who your true identity is unless you're actually professing it. So you can be really technically anyone. And because of that, you can remain relatively anonymous. The area of the internet is widely available. I think there is robust data and internet access in over 180 countries today. It's extremely interactive. You're able to connect all of your social media accounts with, on your phone or your devices. It's an extremely amazing pool of resources. The amazing number of free software that you have in the hundreds of thousands that allow you to protect your identity, network with individuals, and so on. And of course, the online environment is like any social environment because social networking did not start with the internet. Social networking started actually, peer-to-peer, face-to-face in places of worship, in stadiums and house parties. But of course, with the internet, you brought millions and millions of people together without any barriers, and that allowed peer pressure to take place as much as peer support. In fact, the very people who are supporting you are the very people who are pressuring you in the terrorism domain. So let me move to something from early on that I call Cyberterrorism 101. And before I talk about cyberterrorism, I want to point that the definition of cyberterrorism of the late 80s, early 90s was the actual electronic attack against data systems by non-state actors that would potentially result in harm against non-combatants. Great, that's kind of definition of terrorism, but using a cyber medium. But of course, that definition really expanded to include the actual utilization and exploitation of cyber technology to advance terroristic agendas. And this is the Cyberterrorism 101 that I'm actually talking about. So I'm not talking about the actual electronic attacks, but I'm talking about the austere exploitation of cyberspace to advance terrorist agendas. So in 2003, we have a guy named Younes Tsouli, the son of a Moroccan diplomat, living in his parents' house in London. And again, this is kind of with the advent of the US invasion of Iraq. And Younes Tsouli decided that there is not one place online where Al-Qaeda, and specifically the early iteration of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, had to post videos and to get the public to access this multimedia. Mostly they would send it to Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera would air about 30 seconds of it, and that was it. So he decided to take the initiative on his own and built a web forum called Muntada al-Ansar, or a forum of the supporters. And it became very clear there were so many people who were interested in having this hub and this environment to be able to access multimedia, to be able to chat with like-minded individuals. And so a number of individuals, whether from the United States, Middle East, and North Africa, and others joined, and they started talking about jihad and jihad in Iraq. And little that we knew, Abu Maysar al-Iraqi, who at the time headed the media office of Tawheed and Jihad, the previous iteration of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is today ISIS, he took note of this web forum, and he actually reached out to Younes Tsouli, and he was like, hey, I have a proposition for you. We can pretty much give you the raw material, or the edited material rather, and you can just post the video in its entirety on your platform. And that generated a lot of interest from Younes Tsouli, but also from the followers on that platform. So you have someone like Ihsan Siddiqui, the guy with the glasses right there, who actually attempted to commit acts of terrorism here at home. He's originally from Georgia, so I should mention. A number of other individuals, from all over the world. But it didn't stop there, because in 2005, Yunus Suli was arrested, sentenced to 10 years in prison in the UK, and actually was released a couple of years ago. And right now he's in Morocco trying to find a job, maybe. But the legacy of Yunus Suli that was left led many others to establish online environments, again, for the same cause. But they learned a little bit from Suli's lesson. They decided to use obfuscated names like Clear Guidance or Islamic Networking, which sounds like a place where Muslims can find a wife and get married, but which wasn't the case. In fact, there were obfuscated jihadist websites. And you see that they released them in English, and that attracted a lot of individuals from English-speaking countries or non-Arabic-speaking countries to join. As a matter of fact, Hassan Siddiqui himself went from Muntada al-Ansar to Clear Guidance, which became Islamic Networking later on. But what's interesting is so many successful and foiled plots were connected to individuals who were members of these forums. If we're talking about Omar Hamami, right? He was a major leader in Shabab al-Mujahideen in Somalia before they killed him later on. We have Daniel Maldonado right there in the middle. And Daniel Maldonado actually was a failed rapper from Florida, and he was trying to find his cause, and I guess he couldn't, and he decided he wanted to join Shabab al-Mujahideen in Somalia, carrying his own baby, where he was arrested at the airport. You have Saima Muhammad and Fahim Ahmed, two of the Toronto 18 plot, which involved 13 adults and 5 minors. Their attack would have been catastrophic if it actually took place, and many others. So one of the comments I found, this is again from a long time ago, SubhanAllah, is it just me, or is every moderator and person associated with this forum is being arrested? Well, maybe it's not because about the watchdog of law enforcement. Maybe it's because those individuals were actually taking action and plotting and seeking recognition well beyond just the online arena. One of the most infamous cases, if not the most infamous case of all time, is the case of Dr. Humam al-Balawi, or AKA Abu Dujan al-Khurasani. Abu Dujan al-Khurasani was a Jordanian doctor in his early 30s in Jordan. And little that we knew, he was actually the administrator of a couple of different pro-Al-Qaeda websites, which became recognized by Al-Qaeda later on and actually were endorsed. I actually tracked Abu Dujan al-Khurasani's online footprint a year before he committed the suicide bombing in Khost in Afghanistan, killing 7 CIA agents. What's interesting is that he was recruited by the Jordanian intelligence, who also presented him to the CIA, and they thought they recruited him for good to spy on Al-Qaeda. But really his true allegiance was to Al-Qaeda, because by the time he got there, he got the training. He decided to meet with the so-called CIA agents that were handling him, but his true allegiance was truly to Al-Qaeda, in which, again, it ended up with the suicide bombing that you probably heard about from Zero Dark 30 or from the book Triple Agent. But this was the very first time after his operation that Al-Qaeda recognized the importance of the online arena. The number 3 leader in Al-Qaeda at the time, Sheikh Mustafa Abu Yazid, specifically talked about al-Khurasani's operation and the importance of jihadi web forums and how important these jihadi web forums were for such operations. So I did a little bit of study with my colleagues at the time. In 2010 in July, we wanted to see al-Khurasani, when he departed to Waziristan in Pakistan, did he bring anybody with him? What's interesting is that we found all of this information about all of these individuals who were part of the same online ecosystem, who departed the cyber field to the battlefield and joined Abu Dujan al-Khurasani on the ground, including some of them who had enough skill set to build bombs and others. A year and a half later, the network was much bigger, and this is, again, what we were able to gather. You have people like Al-Qayrawani, who was running Al-Qaeda's external operations in Europe. You had somebody like Abu Abdurrahman al-Qahtani, a master explosive bomber, as well as Ghazwan al-Yemeni. Very notable names that you became aware of later on, but truly, these were just users online who were just supportive of Al-Qaeda. And so we fast forward with the the ISIS type of online terrorism. And what ISIS was able to do that no other group has done before was compartmentalizing, categorizing, and segmenting its media apparatuses. What it was able to do is basically customize the messages according to the target audience, which was not the case before. It also customized it in multiple languages, and it also customized it as a multimedia. So not only videos, audios, and PDFs and images, but it established its own radio station, which 99.8 FM at the time in 2014, 2016, was only in 3 cities: Mosul, Raqqa, and Sirte in Libya. But a year later, they were able to broadcast to millions of people because of online streaming. So they basically tried to make their name, again, a household name. But most of this data that you were gathering from Twitter or Facebook or other social media environments started as a repository in the deep web environment where, again, it's not indexed, so most people were not privy to that environment. So every time Twitter or Facebook or YouTube suspended a video, all they had to do is go to a web forum, bring that copy back, and just put it online. And so this is kind of describing that very process where even if you did not know how to use social media, certain jihadists put out actual how-to manuals, how to use Facebook, how to use Twitter, how to proliferate and create multiple accounts. And then use technology that we use on a daily basis, not just Twitter, Facebook, and others, but also the Box app, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, Dropbox, which they continuously are using today. So we heard all about Telegram and the encrypted chat service that allows individuals to communicate more privately than other places. So what's interesting is that it wasn't just about ISIS proliferating there. There are a lot of different groups. There are cybercriminal groups and fraud activities taking place there. But for the sake of terrorism, actually, most people who are on Telegram supportive of ISIS or Al-Qaeda and others are not connected to the group itself. They have no membership. They are completely decentralized. But it's taking, it's taking it upon themselves to proliferate. So they went the extra mile, not only to share propaganda, but also to release things like hacking tools and establish marketplaces or black markets where you can purchase so-called ISIS merchandise. There are weapons markets where WhatsApp numbers are provided. You can call the number or text the number, and then you're able to organize a deal to purchase a weapon for relatively cheap prices. So what I like to call the jihadist on the go activity that Telegram really made possible is that you also have kind of the opposite side of building bombs. You have the countermeasures and how to basically be a successful jihadist on the go alone. Thus, I guess the name lone wolf, but I'd like to call them lone actors because they're just not centrally connected to a group. But what became a really difficult process to download a video in the early days became so successfully easy when joining just a few channels on Telegram and looking at the repository of multimedia that allows you to deal with interrogations, build explosives and chemicals, have countermeasures and weapons. But even recently, the groups that are supportive of Al-Qaeda have started putting out certain material on biochem weapons, for example, which could have catastrophic impact. Moving on to ISIS hacktivism, or what I'd like to call that, we saw the advent of that with the hacking of the Twitter account of US CENTCOM, which, by the way, was not a major deal because it was hacking of a Twitter account, which is a good reminder to have two-factor authentication more than anything else. But because ISIS supportive guys were able to hack that Twitter account of the US CENTCOM or Central Command, it was showing that ISIS had a better reputation than the cyber hygiene of US CENTCOM, which is a major victory from a PR standpoint. But with that, we had a number of groups proliferating to issue threats against the United States, release personally identifiable information of US government personnel as well as others. But it went the extra mile for certain users to become software developers and develop software on their own to support ISIS. For example, Junaid Hussain, you probably heard of the name before, Tunisian French user who's supportive of ISIS, created multiple software like encrypted communication similar to PGP, or a DDoS tool in which he targeted 7 different websites, successfully taking down the website of the Iraqi Ministry of Oil and the Egyptian Ministry of Interior with just one tool. And also he created a file deleter which allows you to wipe your hard drive if you're going to be interrogated. So again, this is the activity of one person, and while they remain under sophisticated, it's just showing signs of progression and growth. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the weaponization of drones, which the previous panel covered beautifully. But just looking at some of the chatter and some of the ideas that have been discussed among ISIS supporters in the dark web and what they've been talking about, I call it the curious case of weaponized drones, because everybody's familiar with what ISIS is doing, dropping bombs in certain places in Iraq and Syria. But what a lot of people don't know is that there has been multiple software released by jihadists allow you to train on using a drone software at home to be able to train yourself before you're able to go out in the field and weaponize them and use them. I came across a manual of 28 pages that allows you to build a drone from scratch using turbo engines, using automatic weapons added, RC radio controllers, and HD cameras, and then you can terrorize a lot of different people. But the idea here is to target gas and oil fields and plants, aviation industry, stadiums and sporting events. When you mix that with individuals talking about extracting ricin and weaponizing it, or extracting other potentially dangerous poisonous gases and others, and connecting that with a weaponization of drone, the results could be absolutely catastrophic. So thank you so much for listening to me. I know I had to fly through this presentation really quickly, so I look forward to any questions you guys might have. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm going to continue with what Laith started, talking about hacktivism. So my presentation is titled The Cold War, Examining the hashtag Operation ISIS Hacktivism Campaign Against Cyber Caliphate. But then the first question that we have to ask ourselves, and the reason we're here, is where we are threat. Is there a cyber terrorism threat? So scholars have shown that there is evidence that ideological or terrorists also engage in computer hacking and attacks against network computer systems. And also that tech-savvy terrorists use tools of modern digital life to extend the reach of a terror group far beyond its physical location, which already my colleagues have talked about it. So I just wanted to introduce a little bit about the Cyber Caliphate and about Junaid Hussain, who is known to be, he calls himself also Abu Hussein al-Britanni. He and a group of his friends started a hacker group called Team Poison. And the group Team Poison were famous for website defacement, vandalism such as denial of service attacks to key websites such as NATO, the UN, and also key figures such as former Prime Minister Tony Blair. It is known, or it is believed, that Junaid Hussain was ISIS lead propagandist in the Cyber Caliphate, and he's known to have developed much of the cyber and social media strategies. After his death, the group of Cyber Caliphate Army was formed, and there are so many different groups. I didn't just want to list them here, but all of them belong to the Cyber Caliphate. But then, how capable are they? What are the cyber capabilities of these terrorist groups? So some scholars, Evan and his colleague, argue that there are 3 levels of cyber capabilities. So the first one is enabling, and this is what we've seen so far that terrorists are using: social media accounts, websites, and also which they use to recruit or to share the propaganda. And then the next level is disruptive. So this is where the hacking or the hackers come in. So this is where they conduct cyber breaches. They either do the defacement, so like to vandalize a website. They also engage in financial theft and fraud. And the third skill is destructive. Oops. The third skill is destructive. So this is where they will engage in digital control, controlling digital systems, disabling control and safety systems. But then so far what we've seen is that these groups are only at the enabling stage. Some of them, like ISIS, have already gone into the disruptive stage. But that doesn't mean that they can't go into the destructive phase, given the technological advancement and the easy access to technology. So what does hacktivism have to do with this? So I'm talking about hacktivism from the part of groups such as Anonymous. I'm not talking about ISIS activism here. So activists are actually loosely organized group of activists capable and willing to hack for political reasons. Or we can call them patriotic hacking, such as the collective group of Anonymous. So there's some types of hackers, the white hat or gray hat, these are professionals or ethical hackers. And then we have the black hat, these are criminal hackers. And then the terrorist group, we can also label them black hat hackers. But then it's important to notice that not every hacker is skilled. There are various skills level of hacking. So some of them, they're just beginners. And they're called script kiddies, so that this means that they're being given script or code to follow, and they do the hacking job. So anyone here can do that. You don't have to have skills. So some of the hackers' tools and tactics which have already been mentioned, so the phishing, spamming, whereby you to send spam emails to people or to computers that they want to access. They spread viruses and worms, such as malicious software or malware, where they conduct web defacement. So this means they will change a website using any image or any content they want. Where they conduct distributed denial of service by making a website busy so that people who use it cannot get access to it. And also the dark web, or as we've heard about it. So I was interested, my research questions are, what are the roles of activists in disrupting cyberterrorism? I had two questions in mind. So how do the patriotic hackers disrupt terrorist groups online platforms? And what is the impact of the hacktivist campaign against these terrorist groups? So I did kind of a small case study, which I'm still working on, and I looked at the Operation ISIS campaign. So this campaign began, they've been using the hashtags Operation ISIS, ISIS, or Operation Paris. It began during the 2015 attacks in Paris, and that's why the Operation Paris was one of the campaigns by Anonymous hackers. So it's believed that three groups, the Anonymous, GovSec, and ControlSec, are the ones who started this campaign. So they intend to hinder ISIS, ISIS recruitment and propaganda on the social media or online through the website. So what they do is they track and report these accounts by these recruiters and these propagandists, and then they ask social media platforms or social media organizations to ban these accounts. They claim responsibility for shutting down terrorist websites, hundreds of terrorist websites, and also social media accounts. But then the problem is it's chaotic because it's not organized. It's a group of anonymous who are all over the world, and they're doing this behind the screen. So some problems occur that they censor wrong accounts or they vandalize wrong websites, and this causes problem. And also they hinder or they disrupt legitimate counterterrorism efforts by doing this. Twitter also has suspended some of these Operation ISIS hackers while they were doing this work. And also ISIS threatened a reverse hack, literally just saying, if you hack us, we'll hack you back. So there's kind of a Cold War between those groups. So this is what they do or how it works. So they will post, like the one on the left, they actually have a photo of someone. I cannot verify this, so I'm not going to say this is a terrorist or not. But they post someone's name, the account, like this one is from Facebook. a Facebook account, and then they ask people to report these accounts. And they will have the name, the IDs of accounts, and on the link. And then they'll post it on Twitter and ask people to report these accounts. And then, well, like I said before, Twitter has also been suspending these groups. So some of them, like here, they're complaining about, they consider themselves volunteers. So they're doing this work for Twitter. And they're saying that Twitter is basically, we're trying to keep ISIS off the social media platform, but then you're wrongly suspending them. Yeah, and this one here is say that he's an active protector of your platform, rooting out extremists on your behalf. So they consider themselves doing the policing work on Facebook or on social media, and they're doing this on behalf of Twitter or Facebook or any other social media account. So I did collect data from Twitter using these hashtags, Operation ISIS, Op ISIS, and Op Paris. And of course, I didn't get much back, so I only got 3,000, but I'm still working on that. And some of these, about 700 are retweets, 2,000 are tweets, and about 166 unique usernames. The majority of these tweets were in English, and then some other languages. I did a social network analysis just to look at the network of these users who are using these hashtags. So as you can see, this is just one of the timeline of Twitter statuses from the past 9 days. And as you can see, sometime in March until the beginning of this April, there's been a lot of statuses or posts about this Operation ISIS campaign. And also, I wanted to look at who posted more. So as you can see, it's kind of skewed to the right. So this group Control Sec are the ones who were most active in this network, and they've posted more than 2,000 tweets. They also have a larger follow group of people who are following them. If you look, you can look at their Twitter account. It's live, so you can just see what they've been doing. And they say their mission is to participate in the cause and report the target sent from our accounts. Again, I wanted to look at the tweet activity versus influence. The group Control Sec, they posted the most. They have a large following, about 25,000 people. So that means they're reaching more people, even if they don't have large followers, like the people on this here on the left. They don't post, they rarely post, but they have large followers. So when I looked at the network analysis of these mentioned activity network, as you can see, there are a lot of different clusters. So these are groups, and they're all connected by this person here in the middle. So this is a Control Sec account. So that means this person here, or this user, has control or has a leadership control of this network. Information goes through this person here, and goes to this group, and also and connects to this group. I don't know about the rest, the outliers. So this is one of the statistics I found from the Control Sec Twitter account. This is what they claim. They have identified as ISIS account. The last month in January 2019, they identified about 6,000 accounts. And then in February, they identified about 6,000 accounts of ISIS users who are still on Twitter. And this one here is the same. I got it from their Twitter account. And this one here, they compare how the 2018 and 2019. So they're arguing that in 2019, they've so far targeted about 6,000 accounts. And Twitter has suspended about almost the same accounts that they have identified. They argue that within a day, they identify about 200 accounts of Twitter, of ISIS users on Twitter. That is a daily account. So in conclusion, I just want cyberterrorism is still at threat. And I think I argue that hacktivism may play a role in countering cyber attacks and also terrorist use of technologies. So they consider themselves protectors and volunteers, and they're willing to do that work. Larger tech companies do not need users or people like Hacktivists to do the work. They can do it by themselves. But smaller tech companies that doesn't have these resources or people who to help them can benefit from Hacktivists. They can be given a set of rules and how to correctly identify and flag terrorist material or used as trusted flaggers. So this is part of my limitation. Data. I need more data. And this is what I'm still working on. And I also have a lot of questions. I'm sure you also have the same questions. Right? What's the legality of anonymous cyber attacks? Is it legal? Is it ethical? What is the impact of the campaign? How many websites, social media accounts have been actually identified and have been banned as a result of this campaign? How can small tech companies without resources to detect terrorism content benefit from hacktivism? And how do security professionals, ethical hackers, and tech companies view the role of political hackers in countering cyber terrorism? Thank you.
So first I want to thank everyone who's put this event together. I think we've all done event planning at some time in our careers, and we know how difficult it is, so thanks so much for having us all here. Today I'm going to be talking about cyber terrorism and tech and terrorism. And one of the things I wanted to do is parse these into two different categories, because there's utility in looking at them together, but then also trying to look at the distinct parts to sort of say what do we need to do in our response to these different challenges. So we're going to dive right in. So on the right side here, these are the delightful images you get anytime you look up cyber terrorism. I don't know why any of these actors would really need a face mask, because if they are that advanced, they should just know that they could put a sticker over their camera. I could do some consulting. Apparently this is also like a stand-up thing. So anyway, to hop right in, popular conceptions of Islamic State hackers and cyber terrorists conventionally evoke images of inexplicably hooded figures lurking behind laptops, coding unimaginably detrimental software. And from the public conscious to really political rhetoric and what policymakers and practitioners, or more so policymakers, often discuss, this misconception really places a really wide array of different activities into sort of one homogeneous category, making it difficult to parse out the nuances of different networks and tactics. Oftentimes, this branding can actually overplay their capabilities, and sort of by saying that that they are sort of falling into one category, it really inflates public perception of the problem. So one of the things we looked at for a project that's coming out where we try to address some of the findings in the cases I'll discuss here is looking at Pew data. And in 2016, cyber terrorism ranks higher than Iran, China, infectious disease within the American public's perception of threats to the United States. And that's really important to pay attention to, because when we have this really amalgamous definition of what is cyber terrorism and is violence included in that definition and what's the scope of it, we begin to have trouble breaking it down. So layered onto this is the prolific nature of Islamic State propaganda online. So really paired with a peaked but murky comprehension of cyber threats by the public, this creates an environment where actors with ties to the group are presumed to pose a genuine threat to national security and really possibly critical national infrastructure. And we don't know what the possibilities are, so we can sort of assume the worst case scenarios. But unfortunately, this really conflates the ability to produce and disseminate targeted propaganda, which they are really good at, with being able to conduct and carry out offensive cyber attacks. So to confront this really elusive problem, it's vital that we break it down and start looking at really concrete cases. So today I'm going to speak really just to one case. The case of Artit. See, this is the guy once you take off the mask, he's pretty happy. So beginning in 2015, Kosovar national and hacker Artit provided support to the Islamic State by transmitting personally identifiable information on Western European citizens to the Islamic State, mostly operatives operating in Raqqa. So Farizi was a computer science student at a Malaysian university, and he was leading a group of ethnic Albanian hackers at the time, and that group, sort of beyond just ISIS-related work, compromised over 20,000 websites throughout Eastern Europe, Israel, and the United States. Just because this was his side hustle. He also managed an online file sharing service that was disseminating ISIS propaganda. So on June 13th, 2015, this comes after Junaid Hussain, who was highlighted in earlier talks, his open source hack. So he shared about 100 names and information about these addresses that he mostly got through LexisNexis, which is a publicly available tool. So at least somewhat inspired by and at least aware of this hack from before, Farizi illegally obtained system administrator level access to servers of an Illinois-based company and accessed customer records for databases using SQL injection. And basically, he got access to 100,000 of the store patrons. And then it's kind of clunky because what he did to navigate and identify military personnel within that is just search their emails for .mil and I think .dod and sort of and .gov emails to try and parse those out from the rest of the data. And he sent these to Junaid Hussain, who later posted it online. So although this is very scary and absolutely for the people who are on the list, I think the list consisted of 1,351, according to criminal complaint and affidavit for his case. The scale of this is not quite what we sometimes portray it to be, or it's a little different. And yet, this is really one of the more sophisticated, publicly available and publicly identified cases, at least in both the US court documents and some of the more high-profile cases. So the real caveat to this is there's a lot that we don't know and that could be ongoing, and the more advanced actors are not necessarily the ones who get picked up by law enforcement and prosecuted, so we have information publicly available about those cases. So, what is sort of the impact of this? Artit Farizi's hacking efforts have resulted in the publication of one of the best-known lists, but doxing efforts have sort of limited impact. In the case that I have coming out, or in the article I have coming out with a colleague later this month through CTC Sentinel, we start to look at the cases in the US to try to say, does this actually result in physical action? Or is this really, really coercive in sort of the sense that it scares people and has an impact in that fashion? So we work through cases like that of Terrence McNeil and Safi Yassin, Marie Castelli, and Harris Kamar. Harris Kamar is one of the two people that we could identify who actually traveled to look at the addresses of leaked information. He drove by two of the houses in Virginia and told a confidential witness that he had seen undercover enforcement or law enforcement near the houses, protecting the houses. So to our knowledge, this hasn't actually resulted in any physical violence, and yet it has tremendous impact in terms of fear. The National Counterterrorism's Laura Xiao explains that ISIS's hacking abilities are minimal, but it really largely comes down to intimidation tactics. So to conclude and get ready to pivot, and wrapping up the comments on the cyberterrorism section, while the flow of terrorist content online and the feasibility of attack planning is certainly problematic, these require completely different interventions than some of the different threat types that we're looking at in terms of cyberterrorism, whether it's web defacements, hacking, et cetera, DDoS attacks, as we sort of mentioned earlier. And we also need to really parse out things like the technical capabilities that each method requires, the likelihood the plan actually comes to fruition, so we can have these worst case scenarios, but what's also the most likely? The genuine nature of the relationship between online operatives and the group. So there are a lot of these different hacking collectives and murky affiliations, but those are those actually at the direction of the organization, in support of the organization, and what does that mean? And one other thing we really need to talk about is we sort of focus on offensive cyber operations, but a lot of what the Islamic State, at least formally, is doing in a lot of online networks is actually trying to provide defensive support in terms of sharing information about how to be operationally secure online. Or Electronic Horizons Foundation is sort of this media entity or semi-media entity that is literally set up to educate people about how to be secure online. So these are quite different to sort of the messaging and communications apparatus that also really deserves our consideration. So looking at terrorist exploitation in communications, technology responses to this problem set. So it's fantastic to have someone from Twitter here today, because Twitter's API is very accessible and has been a great tool to study this. This is just coming from one study where I was using sort of a time series analysis. This data set is from 63 weeks of data collection of English language ISIS sympathizers that were handpicked. It's not a perfect methodology, and I'll be happy to answer questions about it. But what we're trying to look at is how sympathizers respond to change over time. And this was really a study that was trying to see what's happening in terms of the numbers, as we know that Twitter's counterterrorism policy is ramping up to take these accounts down. And we know that because of transparency reports that are produced by the organization, which are a very fantastic resource for researchers and policymakers alike. So first, when we sort of look at these numbers, and this is change over time, we can say, okay, factors like declining tweet frequency, mounting account suspensions, falling follower counts, sure, these indicate signs of success for Twitter. And that's awesome for Twitter, but what does this mean for the rest of the landscape? And do we give ourselves a pat on the back when we start producing these results, or do we need to ask more questions? So looking beyond the numbers and inside this data set to try and illustrate things, the decline in activity by English language IS sympathizers is caused by a range of factors, including Twitter's suspensions, ISIS's strategic shift away to other messaging platforms, operational security considerations. So let's just cruise some of the different, these are our users who are in the data set. So up top on the left, we have Abu Musab al-Riki. This user down in the bottom, they have a Telegram account. We started to see Telegram accounts become more common as the data set went on, and sort of they're talking about these other tools more. Suspended to the right, we have New Era Jihadi 66. This is Harris Kamar. This is the same guy from Virginia who actually drove to two people who are on one of the kill lists. He had, I think on his criminal complaint and affidavit, he had 67 accounts at the time of his arrest. But based on our data set, we saw, I think the highest number we saw was the 81st account, because he used the same naming convention. So is that success if somebody is creating 87 accounts in response to the policy? And just sort of how we can think about this. Next, we see coordinated efforts between different platforms. And lastly, we actually see public opinion and sort of jihadi public opinion and really resistant to a lot of these policies. And how they're framing it is actually a narrative of persecution. And that's really important to pay attention to, because this is an organization that has sort of since earlier days really coasted on recruiting using the narrative of persecution. So considering that takedowns are a huge part of how we address this, and the takedown strategy has really been advanced, at least in the United States, since 2006 in the Baghdad sniper video, what does this mean for how we look at and think about the problem today? So jihadists love memes, so I decided to create my own meme, but it's really not that cool. And our students told us that once, and I was like, thanks guys, great feedback. But here, we have the presumed threat picture and the actual threat picture. Believe it or not, this is not a real network map, it's a simulated one, but I think it'll do the trick. So here, we have the presumed threat picture. We're getting to a point now where we know to say, and policymakers are learning to say, okay, we need to say Telegram. We need to say encrypted messenger. We don't need to know what that means, but we need to say it. We need to say YouTube. But the way we treat a lot of these are these siloed platforms that are separate and distinct. When we call technology providers to testify, we tend to call the top ones, but the users we study are no longer really dominating that space. Sure, they may have a platform or maybe coordinating efforts behind the scenes to have like an account bank where they're injecting this stuff onto broad-based platforms, but really they're navigating all of these tools. And when we think about the tools, we need to think not exclusively about operational security affordances, but also usability. While sort of using Tor can be one way to save these files, and when it's taken down, you can go and grab it from wherever you've saved it. Another thing is just these third-party, less regulated things like Just Paste It. Just Paste It is run by one guy, and yeah, and dealing with a hell of a time trying to, if you're tasked with addressing both child pornography and terrorist content, it's really hard to say that you should pick one or the other, depending on your bandwidth. And maybe that's a personal judgment, but these are challenges that technology providers are dealing with in very, very real time. And then the other thing is realizing that users don't navigate the system in the same way, or they don't even necessarily have the same approaches. And one last thing is that the affordances of these tools can really depend in terms of like file sharing size. ISIS's videos have known to sort of vary in duration. I may want to use one platform to share a longer video and another platform to share a clip that's 30 seconds. Because I can't share that on Twitter, but I can very easily share it on Telegram. So the way that we think about profiling and how people choose different behaviors, we need to think about their technologies. So an additional challenge as we look at content moderation as a solution is that the vast majority of what the violent extremists I study share is not content that violates the law, terms of service regarding the promotion of terrorism, or really anything that necessarily warrants being taken down. So this is where, as liberal democracies, we actually need to be quite careful in our recommendations and start thinking about all of these different challenges. So number one, there's an evolving structure of communications within IS Central. So they have formal media outlets, but then all of these affiliates. And then they also have infighting and fracturing within the organizations and disparate media organizations through that. So really being able to say, okay, what does this mean? Are we taking down official content or sympathetic content? Next, a significant, oh, I already said this part, so skip on down to the bottom. The gray zone between problematic terrorist content and material that is suitable for the public highlights the need for tactics that actually really complement content removal. These are all things we've seen on Telegram. News stories don't violate terms of service, and they're one of the most common URLs shared among English language ISIS sympathizers in the data set. And these are just sort of the problem sets to say, okay, what other mechanisms can we use? Whether it's two-step verification, which means it's harder to get accounts, or preventing or limiting IP hopping. Other things that we could sort of consider are sort of limiting pick your own number apps. You can, in seconds, you don't even need a burner phone, but you can just get burner numbers very easily. And Facebook, for example, I spent one weekend trying to register new accounts just to see how easy it is. And those steps are really challenging to circumvent. I've tried different apps for it. And by making the barrier to entry just more clunky, it makes sure that those who are working to promote free speech or speak out or for humanitarian reasons can still have access to these tools while trying to limit and sort of marginalize nefarious uses. So I'm sure I'm about to get the hook and be kicked off stage. But just to wrap up really quickly, in subsequent evaluations of threats posed by cyberterrorism and terrorists online, it's vital to remain rooted in how terrorist organizations are actually using the tools. I think this is transferable for organizations across the ideological spectrum and persuasion. It's important to stay vigilant and prepared to cope with the worst case scenarios, but again, focusing on terrorists' use of the internet now, and also how criminal enterprises use the internet, is going to be really vital to informing what's the most likely. So while IS does not demonstrate an overwhelmingly extensive cyber operations capability at present, they're very interested in operational security and more defensive postures to remain online. And these are other sort of aspects that need to be part of the conversation moving forward. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all. Those were terrific presentations. So I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to restrain myself and let you guys ask questions because I can always talk to y'all later. And if not, then I do have questions. So do people have over here?
Test.
That's our question.
Hello, my name's Jed Anderson. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Furman University. One of the questions I'd like to direct to everyone in the panel, actually, is we've talked a lot about hacktivism by ISIS organizing on social media platforms, so on and so forth. One of the questions I had is, has there been any research looking at sites that deal with computer tools, for example, exploit database, GitHub, because I have seen extremist presences on there, if not, while there's not so much polemics. Yes.
Well, I don't know about research, but I know that GitHub are looking seriously at the issue.
I guess I have to switch this on. Check. Okay. I want to take it a little bit out of that specific framework and maybe turn the attention to something very similar, which is what I like to call hacking for ISIS 3.0. We saw hacking for ISIS 1.0 when someone like Junaid Hussain was doing something on his own, trying to use his skills as a former hacker with Team Poison. And we saw the case of Artit, which is the case of an individual who's non-allegiant to ISIS, yet was able to cooperate with someone like Junaid Hussain and provide him with data that was not so much hacked, but more like socially engineered and collected. My fear and my nightmare is when so-called ISIS cyber actors are, if you will, are being used by more sophisticated actors as a scapegoat, if you will. We've seen certain signs of Russian hacking activity integrating with iterations of the Cyber Caliphate. So Fancy Bear, for example, as you're probably familiar with that name, there were legitimate rumors. I don't want to say evidence because I can't speak about it in detail, but that some elements from Fancy Bear have quote unquote infiltrated groups like ISIS or pro-ISIS hacking groups, and that allowed it to provide a little bit of sophistication for them to be able to establish certain tools like I was talking about, or do a little bit more of hacking third parties to gather more details. We recently saw the case from the Georgia woman, 20 years old, who was also arrested as part of the United Cyber Caliphate, who does not look like she is allegiant to ISIS, but was kind of providing a skill set for everybody to give her some recognition under, I think she had like 9 different monikers. So I would look at the nexus where pro-ISIS cyber actors who are rubbing shoulders with more sophisticated cyber criminals in places like the deep and dark web, on GitHub, on other places, who have the sophistication to do things like Bitcoin transactions, or have the sophistication to do, exfiltration of data and other types of more sophisticated hacking activity. And I think the learning curve comes with more of ISIS supportive actors making accounts on environments like exploit.com and others, and learning from that environment, even if paying a small amount of money to be able to have access to certain environments like that, and then just learning from the non-jihadist cyber criminals who are always more sophisticated than jihadist cyber actors.
Yeah. And if I can hop on that, I think one of the really interesting challenges in our center, I work for an organization called the Program on Extremism, and we use a lot of legal documents to inform what's happening. So number one, there's a bit of a lag time. So this Kim Vo case that he just talked about, a lot of her activity was taking place in 2017. And when you start looking at trying to unpack who these actors are, and layering on the online space, it can take a really long time to start really putting the pieces together. Sally Jones, for example, who is Junaid Hussain's wife, after he died, leaked additional information and trying to parse out, like, was this actually from the original and they didn't share this before, and figuring out where that data comes from. So in terms of research, if people are working on this, I highly encourage you to also look into court filings, because they're becoming more and more transparent, at least from the ones that I see. And now, because these investigations have just been going on, then some of the lower level cases where somebody clearly broke the law and are not as trained on anonymous software, or like taught how to be operationally secure, possibly by people who are better trained. It's a waiting game, and it's hard to know in really real time, but I think that we're starting to learn so much more now, as like between the Fancy Bears, pseudo revelations or possibilities. But one other thing I want to say really quickly, and I don't want to completely monopolize the time, is that Especially in the online space, we actually also need to think about all of the other actors that are trying to play the interference game. So in this ISIS data set, in the study that we did, one of the greatest rallying points was this very weird closed interlick hashtag. And when I say it was one of the greatest, I would probably say it was when the ISIS sympathizers we were studying were on the same page. Turns out, ISIS Central was not trying to drive that message. When you look into it, it's a couple of users who looked like ISIS sympathizers and qualified for our data set for that reason, exclusively sharing Russia Today and Sputnik. Interesting. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm doing my best, but it's a little sketchy. And it could have been not necessarily targeted for this audience, but when we start looking at all of these players who are acting in the same space anonymously, we don't know who's going to be influenced by who or who will learn what skills from who.
I had a question, a comment or a thank you. Thank you for asking that question, because now I know where I'm going to look next for data. So yeah, I didn't think about GitHub or those channels, but there's so many channels coming up. I lost count. There's GroupMe, there's Discord, there's I don't know what. So there's so many places or so many platforms that can be used. And we've tended to look at just maybe one or two platforms because of accessibility, the easy way to get the data. But there's so many channels or so many places where we can look and find the data. Now I have a new research question. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Emerson Brooking, Atlantic Council. So there seems to be a general consensus now, though it wasn't the case a few years ago, that the danger of public-facing communications from groups like ISIS outweighs their analytic value, that social media companies can and should take down these public communications. But I'm wondering, when it comes to the more private internal communications, like the Telegram networks, which many of you have monitored, when do you think these companies should be disrupting these networks and disrupting the coordination of these groups versus governments and civil society actors infiltrating these lines of communication as well for study and for awareness?
Sure. I'd like to take a crack at that real quick before everybody else, if that's okay. It's a very interesting question. I think it's legitimate to raise. I think if we look at the model of Telegram itself, why it was created in the first place before how it's being used, it was created as a backlash for Facebook acquiring WhatsApp, which the founders of Telegram, who are also the founders of VK.com, the Russian version of Facebook, created it to say, we want more privacy, and WhatsApp is going to be no longer private, so we want to create that. Now, taking privacy and security as kind of two siloed aspects for so many people, but yet they are two faces for the same coin for many other people. And I think for just looking at Telegram itself, while they are doing significant efforts to try to suspend so many activities and suspend so many users and suspend so many accounts, I think the biggest part of why jihadists still survive there is that they're able to obfuscate so well. The environment gives you so much, but they're able to obfuscate whether it's the names they're creating, whether it's creating multiple accounts and then self-suspending those accounts, while using the repository, which by the way, they're hosting on the Telegram cloud, allows for easy access and download for that content. So while we can always try to say, is it the responsibility of Telegram to remove all of this content? As we've seen that Facebook, Twitter, and others who have a lot more money are still also struggling to take some of that content down. Telegram, which has less money, it's less controlled, and they have placed their servers in 5 different countries so far. They have less ability to take down that content. So it's not that they're not doing enough, they just don't have the capacity to do more, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think layered onto that too, and I think that there are many reasons why Telegram was really developed for its capacity. Another thing is that the creators had to hand over data to the Russian government from VK because of the Ukrainian crisis as well. So there are ideological components behind the organizations to which Pavel Durov, the creator, has spoken to quite publicly, but there are also these they're the optics and then the practical reasons in having a competitive application to WhatsApp. But sort of layered onto this is sort of the prism that content removal doesn't necessarily need to be our only limitation. I think that it's very easy to say that Telegram is doing nothing, but they've also made lots of different parts of their tools more accessible than it has been before. For example, if you're developing an app, or if you're developing sort of a tool within Telegram, you're actually supposed to write the information about how you've done that on GitHub and share that. So that's just a kind of transparency that isn't the transparency that we're used to asking for, but it's a transparency in its own right that I think is an important step, even if it's not a step that most of the public recognizes. And again, I think that content removal is just one of many content moderation ideas. So if somebody's going to chronically violate terms of service, can you say, if you would like to continue doing this, you need to give us more personal information? That might make sense for one company. And one other thing that is really challenging is not all companies necessarily see content. So there's a media provider where you basically upload documents, and I've chatted with them before, and he's like, well, when we talk to people on the Hill, they say that they want us to moderate content, but I don't think that they know that we don't actually see what our users are sharing. And that's like part of our standard practice. So what does that mean for us? What should we be doing, or what can we tell them that we could do? And it's just about this sort of starting to think creatively and starting to use measures for success and measures for compliance for the counterterrorism agenda as not just takedowns of things we don't like, but using other behaviors to promote a safer internet.
All right, so we're a little bit over time, but I'm going to take my moderating privileges, and we'll have time for one last question. And does anyone have a question? We'll try to be sorry.
Hi, my name is Saad. I am a TCV fellow at the Georgia State. And as you guys discussed the human monitoring of violent content, but how would you classify or include the human biases where the location of the human monitors, where they would purposefully they could take down content that might not be as violent, or they have some personal agendas, we have seen some instances of that. So where is the transparency in that? Thank you.
So in terms of the human monitoring of the larger social media companies, their locations are partly due to costs, but they are also due to the skills that are required to actually pull down the content. So it's not happenstance that they're based in Indonesia. They're going to be based in the Philippines. There's another huge one in Brazil. In terms of whether it's effective, it's a start. If we think of the volume of content creation that is occurring, there's only so much that they can do. And as the other speakers have pointed out, that sometimes it can be quite futile, because what they're actually removing is not the content. They're merely removing the link to the content. So lots of the removal, say by Twitter, isn't actually removing a video or removing an image. That's Instagram's problem. But the link is embedded within a tweet. So it's a very complex thing, but I don't think anyone assumes that human monitoring is the end.
And I would add one more comment. I'm not sure if this is on. That a lot of the content is posted in private file sharing technologies. So Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, Dropbox, the Box app, and others, the company itself is not privy to the content in your own private drive. And as you know, if you have a private, free Gmail account, it gives you about 5 gigabytes of free storage, which is enough for about 10 to 12 ISIS videos. And I have come across in my research ISIS videos living on Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive for 2+ years that have not been touched, and they cannot be touched because, again, it's the concept of privacy versus security. And if you ask anybody at the big tech companies, at least anybody representing or public facing, they will tell you we always err on the side of privacy.